For the menu project, we are going to be working again with text and imagery and graphic elements to create some sort of composition. We are organizing a space within the different content that we have. And really the secret to any good design when we're thinking about these sort of visual elements is these first impressions, right? These visual elements being organized and the proximity of them, the relationship of them being positioned, and exactly how that relationship is going to yield these different results. And a lot of times we'll think about the proximity of them being grouped together, right, within the different sections that you're looking at, whether it's appetizers or entrees or drinks, desserts, so on and so forth. We can really focus on hierarchy and the placement and proximity of your layout to give it that sort of clear understanding to the viewer. And we can also infuse it with some personality, right? Your first impressions of a restaurant are typically going to be the menu that you look at, right? That's going to be something that's going to give you an idea not only about what sort of food they offer, but what the sort of branding is like. You're going to have some elements potentially of the logo on there. In this case here, we can see these graphic elements that kind of play on this idea of water that actually work as sort of dividing lines within the different sections. And then these sort of kind of old school hand-drawn illustrations that give it kind of a vintage feel with this modern twist of these thin lines and updated typefaces and things like that. So the style of the actual text that you use, the imagery, the graphic elements, the colors that you bring into the space, the logo mark that you come up with the actual restaurant, all of these things are going to tie into how we sort of take in the actual menu and take in the actual branding of the restaurant as well. So all of these decisions are going to be something we want to think about within this sort of project. Whether it is something where you are applying this towards one menu, or you're applying this to multiple elements or multiple assets within a design. Oftentimes when we're working within branding and things like that, we're not only just thinking about one particular element, but we're thinking about how we can create some consistency among multiple elements. And we see this a lot within restaurants, right? When we go into restaurants, you may get your menu, and then the actual receipt deal might come on something different. There might have some sort of additional accoutrements that come with that as well. You don't see matches around too often anymore, but that used to be a very common thing within restaurants, things like that, right? Plates, branding, all of these things start to come through within the overall look and feel. And the layout that you're using can often help within that overall meaning and that structure there. So one thing we want to take a look at here are the actual menu contents themselves, right? What do we need to put into this menu, and how are we going to start to divide up this space? Because one of the very, very first things we're going to do here is we're going to be presented with this information for the menu, whether it's the content that you're using from the module, or if you're finding your own content. You're going to want to think about how you can divide this up, how you can use proximity and hierarchy to make it very clear for the viewer to be able to come in and see these different sections, while at the same time creating some interest within the overall design and the layout there as well. So one of the most successful things we're going to be able to utilize here is some sort of grid or guidelines within our structure, right? Because we're dealing with a little bit of content here, we want to make sure that it is clear and organized within the overall layout. So one of the first things we're going to do is figure out some sort of grid structure that's going to be able to be utilized. And that's going to depend on, the formatting of the menu itself, whether you're using a vertical or a horizontal layout. Or the other option for this is to do a bifold menu for this assignment as well, which gives you a much more vertical sort of layout. And would also is going to change the style of grid that you're going to use for this. But regardless of what you use, you're going to want to apply some sort of structure to your design, right? By problem solving using this visual and organizational levels of the grid, it helps to combine elements of ads and within the pictures, the text, the headlines that separate these, and organize all of these together. So most of the time when we go into restaurants, we're pretty familiar with this idea, right? And there's different structures that we can look at. You know, in the previous one, we saw that this is essentially a 3-column grid that we're looking at here, right? In each one of these pages, there's 3 long columns, and they are using some sort of spatial areas here as well. In some, they're spanning 2 different columns here. Others, they're spanning all 3 different columns for these sections. Down here, again, they're jumping back over to 2. So within a 3-column grid that they've created here, these 3 vertical columns that we can see, they're utilizing it in different ways, right? And they're using left and right alignment within that grid structure as well. Other styles that you can do is that sort of center alignment. We still see a clear sense of hierarchy that's happening here with some sort of header that gives us a clear idea of what part of the menu this is, and then the different sections within that. And then even within the different sections within that, we're starting to see a hierarchy of the price that is related to this particular item, or potentially the ingredients, or what description is tied into that particular dish or that drink or whatever it may be, right? So you want to think about this idea of scanning a menu and being able to gravitate towards different sections very easily, not only by compartmentalizing it using a grid, but also using these ideas of hierarchy, using these ideas of size and color within our text, bold and italic, and different styles and options that we have to be able to work with within the formatting as well. So the menu project is intended for you to really think about putting into practice several of the exercises that we've already done within the class here, right? Looking back at some of these modules, going all the way back to the very beginning where we started to explore the idea of grids and modularity, and even coming, full circle into applying this now towards a bigger concept. And when we are going through what we've covered so far, one of the things we've looked at is organization, right? This idea of organization of elements, putting the proximity of them together, utilizing a grid structure to create that consistency within the overall layout. Again, here we can see a single vertical page being used with these 3 columns. And you'll notice that you'll find some similarities in menu layouts and things like that as you potentially do a little bit of research. But where you can get interesting in it is these different design elements, potentially tying in elements of branding beyond just the actual menu itself, and thinking about this restaurant in a bigger sort of idea. Here we can see this old sort of typewriter text being used, and simple graphic elements of actual characters, typed characters used as sort of graphic elements to break up the space and show you the different sections of the menu while still utilizing this grid. And then they're even bringing in these additional graphic elements of this sort of graphing paper in the background, and this sort of stamp that's happening on it as well, almost like if you were to check out a book from a bookstore or something like that. So you can really kind of go into the branding of this, as detailed as you want, and really think about this as a bigger sort of idea than just the sort of menu, and how this could be applied towards these other assets as well. But one of the biggest things I want you to focus on within this project is the organization of information, and utilizing that structure of hierarchy and grids or guidelines to help you do that. And you can see here this being done a little bit differently, where they're kind of creating a more playful space here, but they're still utilizing this element of alignment. So here, instead of the 3 columns, we're now seeing 2 columns used, and they're sort of combining these different typefaces here with this sort of old vintage style of letter forms that you can see, with this more stylistic serif typeface down here as well, introducing a little bit of color into this space, echoing some of that sort of hand-drawn look and feel for the actual logo, with these sort of dividing lines, these graphic elements that are brought into this space as well. And what you'll start to notice in all of these menus, and as menus that you've already looked at in the past, is again the different paragraph styles that we're seeing, or character styles inside of here, meaning the header all is consistent, right? In each one of these, it's the same typeface and the same sizing being used for all of these headers. As you get into the different dishes, they're using all capitals for the titling of the dishes, and they're all set in the same typeface at the same styles. As you get into the description of those dishes, again, now we're using lowercase in that same typeface, but it's consistent within the leading and the styling that's being used. And same thing for the prices, where you're introducing that color of red that's being applied throughout. So those are all different styles that are being set up within the actual format of this that lets us know there's consistency going on. I know that if there's a italic typeface, then it's going to be used as a sort of description because I'm seeing that repeated. It's essentially giving me sort of instructions on the page here, what to look at first, second, and third. So that's going to be something that we're going to work on, is this idea of creating these different styles within the space to help assist us, not only assist the viewer with seeing that information easier, but also assist us with actually formatting this project much easier as well. As we get into this a little bit further, and really next week, we'll look at this a little bit more. We'll also introduce things like graphic elements and images into the space. So you might want to think about the use of borders and decorative borders, which can often be used in menus to kind of divide up the space, potentially even additional images or things like that. Just be cautious with how you use these. You don't want to necessarily apply a border to everything, because then there is no emphasis put on anything, right? Typically, you want to kind of save these for areas that you want to draw the viewer's eyes to. So, think about that within your actual layout. If you are going to use these other elements, which I encourage you to do, just make sure it's in areas where you want the individual's eyes to focus on or look at first. We also want to think about composition, coming back to this menu that we looked at previously. They're doing some interesting things here within this menu. And again, we looked at the actual grid structure that they're using, which is essentially this 3-column grid here. But they're using a vertical layout for this. They're using both sides of the menu. And within the composition themselves, they are utilizing white space effectively too, right? They have this large area of white space up here at the top that really lets the branding for the restaurant come through. Then they're giving these clear margins from the outside, so none of this text is getting too far to the edges of the actual paper. They are kind of using these graphic elements here that tie into the actual theme and things a little bit more, and kind of give you some idea of the actual restaurant name and so on and so forth. And then even within the typography here, they're kind of doing this overlay effect where they're actually using the text on top of these graphic elements here as well, kind of creating interesting composition. I do encourage you to bring photos into your menu, and I've provided a couple of these within the menu, within the module that you can use, or you could find your own in any, as long as it's a high resolution and copyright free. You can use any of the resources for high res images that we've looked at, and those are actually available on the homepage for the Canvas site as well. But you may want to think about how you want to use those photos. Obviously, you want them to tie into the restaurant. You can use different overlay effects on top of these to potentially create some interesting compositions and things like that. But I would encourage you to potentially bring those into the space, maybe even just using them for the cover or an area of the cover of the actual menu. And you can also use different imagery, things like graphic elements, borders, illustrations, so on and so forth. Again, if you are going to be using different imagery like illustrations or things like that, just make sure that they feel consistent. Make sure that they feel like they're within the same style, right? If you go like with an example like this, where they're showcasing the look and the illustration of all of these different drinks here, these all feel like they're done within the same style, right? The line weight is all the same. They feel like they're part of a unified system there. So if you're going to do something like that, you just want to make sure that you are using graphic elements that feel similar to one another and don't feel too far apart. Also think about color within your space. I would suggest that you don't go too crazy with the color. Usually bringing in something like 2 to 3 colors within the overall design and the layout is enough to create that hierarchy effectively. And again, that can kind of be tied into the actual branding of your restaurant. Here we can see for this Cocina Central, they kind of created this yellow and black and white color theme that kind of lives within all of the different design elements here. And then they are creating this really interesting sort of splash of color within this sort of graphic elements that they're using for the coffee cup and the different band and the border treatment of the margins here of the happy hour, kind of infusing a little bit of character into this space. But generally the branding elements are that yellow, black, and white that we're seeing within the space. So I would choose, again, maybe 2 to 3 options to use within your menu, and use that consistently within the actual space. The actual pricing and how you organize the prices is going to be something you want to take into consideration within this project. Where you position those, how you position those, what sort of formatting is going to be applied to those as well. So that's something that you can kind of play with within the overall text that's going to be provided to you. And within the text that I'm going to be providing to you that we're using for the menu project, if you choose to do the content that I provided to you, that is simply given to you just in a very standardized text format. We'll take a look at it here in a second, but the idea is for you to take that and potentially reorganize that if you need to, or certainly create a stronger hierarchy than what's being used within that space. So don't feel like you're tied to exactly how that is written out within that menu content. And if you're using your own menu content that you're pulling from somewhere else, of course, I want you to come up with your own design and not use the same hierarchy that's already being used from that as well. Okay, but things like pricing is something that you can kind of play with within the overall design here and think about how that is going to be shown. Another thing is creating a theme. So, taking into account a little bit further, maybe the branding that's going to go into this project. How can you create some sort of theme within the overall imagery and colors and typefaces that are being used, right? Thinking about if this is a family-friendly restaurant, what sort of typefaces might be applied towards that? Or if this is more of a modern upscale restaurant, what sort of colors or typefaces might be applied towards that, graphic elements and images, so on and so forth. I'm providing you, again, with optional content to use. You can use your own content if you choose to, and you find something that's going to work for this project. But the overall theme, the look and the feel for this restaurant is completely up to you. It's up to you how you want to go about this. If you want this to feel, again, kind of modern, if you want it to feel, like a kind of taking more into like a hand-drawn style like we saw in some of those previous examples or something like that, maybe making it feel different in that way. It's really up to you, and I encourage you to kind of take that and run with it and really try to infuse and think about, again, what colors would go into that theme, what typography would go into that theme, what imagery would go into that theme. There's lots and lots of examples of that within the restaurant industry and how you can utilize that, right? And oftentimes we'll see the style of food that's being used kind of echoed in some of those design elements as well. So that can be one way to kind of infuse that within your style. Not only thinking about the style of, colors and typefaces, imagery, and all that sort of stuff, but how can you potentially bring some, put a unique twist on your menu essentially as well. We see a nice sort of addition here of this overprint in the background where they're utilizing this orange and having menu run through the space on this diagonal, and then drinks running vertically on the menu here on the right. This is an interesting way of sort of calling out what these two different menus are. And, it's this sort of overprint effect that it doesn't distract the reader from necessarily understanding these plates, but it does give some interest into the overall theme of this branding. And it also ties these elements together a little bit more. They're using these very contrasting letter forms here, contrasting colors that create some interest within the overall design. So I know this can kind of seem a little, maybe boring as far as how you're laying this out, but it's only as boring as you make it. If you want to, you can infuse as much personality into these as you choose to do. So looking back at what we've done here a little bit in the past, things that we've explored, we've looked at the grids and the modularity, right? Within those first couple of weeks there. That's going to be something that we're going to need to apply to this assignment. And one of the first things that you're going to want to think about is what the format of this is going to be. Are you going to use a vertical format? Are you going to use a horizontal format? Are you going to use a bifold format, meaning the page folded in half, essentially? We are using an 8.5 by 11 format for this, so it will need to fall within those guidelines. But how you sort of lay that out within the structure is up to you, and that's going to be something that you can play with within your sketches and sort of organizing that information before you get into the computer. Once you figure that out, how can you apply those grids and that modularity to that, right? How can you start to organize that information? Beyond that, how can you start to use typography effectively? I would say use no more than 2 typefaces for this assignment. When you are choosing these typefaces, make sure that there are options within those typefaces, right? When you are looking in Adobe fonts and you are starting to explore typefaces that could potentially work, remember that each one of those typefaces has multiple fonts inside of it. Some have one font or one style of that font. Others have as many as 40 to 60 variations of that particular typeface, those fonts available. Things like bold, condensed, so on and so forth. When you have more options, you're going to have more versatility, right? You're going to have more options yourself when you get into the space to create that contrast within the different sections. So make sure that you're choosing typefaces that have different styles within them so that you can get away with only using 2 different typefaces, but multiple styles within the space. That allows for plenty of hierarchy. Color is another thing that you're going to be able to work with. Again, I would suggest probably not more than 3 colors within your space, unless it's, of course, some sort of image or photo or something like that. But as far as the actual branding elements and things like that, I would say keep it down to a shorter number and try to use those effectively, choosing contrasting colors. And you can always pull from resources like Adobe Color or things like Coolers, which we'll take a look at here as well. And then lastly, hierarchy, which again goes into organizing your information. When the viewer enters into the menu, how can you position it so that they can see clearly what these different sections are, what the different dishes are, any descriptions and prices associated with these, and how can you format that effectively? In this menu here, they're doing this really interesting thing where they have obviously the different sections that are broken up, right? And they're utilizing this sort of old kind of sign making design, if you will, with these old vintage graphic elements and sort of more vintage style typefaces. They're choosing very contrasting typefaces as well, more decorative ones to use for these large numerals that they use for all of the pricing. And then this sans serif typeface, it's very condensed, that allows for these longer titles to fit within that space really easily. And even looking at the pricing here, the pricing is actually larger than the title of the dish, right? They're using all these little dots that are essentially large periods that lead up to the price there, sort of guiding the viewer's eyes over to that space. And then they're using a much smaller, thinner version of a sans serif typeface to create the description for that dish. They're also using capital letter forms and small capitals here for the actual title of the dish itself. So all of these little different decisions are, they kind of get overlooked when you're just looking at the overall grand scheme of things. But these are all different things that I want you to consider. And these are all, again, different paragraph and character styles that you can apply to this text. And once you set these up for one, you can use that style to use for all of the different elements within the design. So going back to what we have kind of covered here a little bit, modularity. Modularity is that idea of a fixed element used within a larger system or structure, right? So that can be anything from the colors being used, from the typefaces being used, the styles, the actual shapes being used. That idea of modularity is essentially that idea of unity. And that's really ties into the idea of a grid, right? This idea of constructing themes that are organized within the space. And going back to the grid is composed of those series of intersecting vertical, like we can see moving up and down here, or horizontal lines, which again create these different rows or these different modules within the space. Now, sometimes you only need verticals, sometimes you potentially only need horizontals, but in any case, you're going to need some sort of grid, some sort of guidelines within your actual design. More than likely in this one, you're going to get away with just multiple columns. You may bring in the horizontal rows as well, but you probably only need columns within this actual project. But you're going to want to think about how many you have, and that again is going to come into the actual layout. And then once you have those columns, how can you span that space? Remember, you don't need to use just one column for your text. You can span that over to 2 or 3 or 4, and you can create variation within there. You also want to make sure that you have clear margins. You don't want your text to get too close to the edge of these pages unless it's purposely going to bleed outside of those pages, right? If you are having some sort of design element that is potentially purposely trying to bleed off, then of course you'd want it to run outside of those margins and potentially even outside of the space. But any sort of pertinent information, anything like pricing or things that have to do with the menu, like descriptions, you want to make sure that there's a clear live area that is, separated from that outside area. So make sure that you have clear margins, clear columns within the space, any sort of running footers or folios, which I don't think you'll necessarily need in here, but you could if you wanted to include, the name of the restaurant or something like that down there. And of course, creating those different spatial zones within the modules too. All of these practices that we looked at from those first couple of weeks are still going to be applied. You can think about variation here. The same text can be applied to 3 different columns or to 2 different columns that are creating, that are using these spatial zones, right? So it's the same information, just organized differently. And that's something that you can kind of start to work out within your sketches. If you don't need a full grid for a particular element, potentially the front cover or the back or something like that, you can always use guidelines within the space as well, which are not quite as complicated as a grid, but they do give you elements to align things to, like we can see in these examples down here. But in one way or another, you want to make sure that you are creating that organization within the space. Okay. Next thing we want to look at is your fonts, the typefaces that you're going to use. You have quite a bit of content that should span the use of several different levels of hierarchy. So you're going to want to choose a typeface that is simple and will work in large areas of text or body copy, along with these headlines and subheaders as well. So the font that you use for the body copy in your print or a web project should be unobtrusive, meaning it should be very easy to read, right? It should not be very decorative. It should be something that you can fit a lot of words, a lot of text into, and it will be easy for the individual to decipher. Save more of those show-off fonts for the things like the headlines and the other elements that require more emphasis. Okay, that's where you can get more decorative with your typefaces, and certainly any sort of branding elements like the logo as well. Many fonts are suitable for this sort of body copy. So this is an example here where we can see the typeface Avenir, right? And we can see that we are looking at 3 different levels essentially of this typeface and how this can be applied to create this hierarchy. So here we can see that the Avenir is used at 48 point. We're using is actually Avenir Next is actually the typeface. It's Avenir that's been redesigned since it was originally created. And we're using heavy over here, which is that very, very bold option at 48 points. So it's really large, it's really bold. This would be a great use for a header, right? Get somebody's attention really quick. This maybe be what the section would be, desserts or whatever. Then you have your subheader, which could potentially be used for the title of the plate, right? This is done at about half the text size. And now we're using demi-bold. So it's not quite as heavy, but it still has a little bit more emphasis to it there. Lastly, we have our body copy, which is going to be the smallest text, 14-point text, and we're setting this as regular, right? So It's very easy to read. We can fit a lot of words in here, and we can decipher that very easily. And we can see that there's these 3 clear, distinct levels being used here, all within this same typeface of Avenir Next. So you can see that by choosing one typeface that has multiple options inside of it, you can create a much stronger hierarchy than potentially using multiple typefaces within the space. If you are going to use multiple typefaces, which is fine, I would suggest not using more than 2, maybe 3 if you really have to. But think about contrasting those. There's no use in pulling in another typeface unless it looks very different, right? If you're going to use something that looks very similar, then just use a different typeface that has other options inside of it. There's no point in using 2 serif typefaces that look very, very similar to each other, only because the original one you found doesn't have a bold option. Then go back to the drawing board, choose a different serif typeface that's going to have a bold, a light, and italic option, right? And use that for the typeface. If you're going to bring in another typeface, make sure that it's contrasting, potentially bringing in a totally different classification of font. So maybe a sans serif typeface. That's a really good way to create contrast within your design, using a serif and a sans serif typeface. Potentially bringing in a script typeface or a slab serif typeface. There's many different classifications. Just make sure that they're contrasting one another within the typefaces being used. Okay. There's also some typefaces that have certain connotations to them within the design world that it's important to stay away from. Things that get too decorative and sort of just kind of have a bad name for themselves within the design world. It's best to kind of find something that might look a little bit different from that, essentially. These are just some examples here of some typefaces that have potentially been overused within the past and just kind of have a bad association applied with them. So there's other options that you can look for. And when in doubt, it's always better to go back to traditional style typefaces than to try to use something that is too overly decorative that is trying to describe that. Next, we want to look at color. Color can evoke emotions, right? So we can also help to identify the different elements within the layout here as well, relaying the message of your communication. So you could think about a colored frame around a group of images to let the reader know that all of those images or all of those particular items are related together, right? You can also think about how you can potentially use color in new and creative ways. So, again, I would suggest that you limit yourself to the amount of colors. But if you do have some sort of really interesting or specific style that you're going for, like we can see in the example here, then potentially there's an opportunity for something like that, right? Now, this is probably not going to be done very often where you have multiple colors used within the space, but it is used effectively within the particular branding of this particular restaurant. Typically, though, I would say use those colors effectively within the actual different sections, breaking those down into maybe 2 to 3 different colors. Visual hierarchy, again, that's going to be the arrangement of the graphic elements in a design in the order of importance. So what do you want the viewer to look at first, second, and third, and communicate that to the viewer? How can you utilize color? How can you utilize size and placement, the actual weight of that typeface to let the viewer know what those different elements are? You're going to have lots of different sections within your menu and descriptions within your plate. So you're going to want to think about how you can break that down. You can see a really nice menu design here, which is utilizing this 3-column grid here again. And they've come up with this 2 different typefaces that they're using. I believe they're using Montserrat here for the sans serif. I'm not totally sure for the serif typeface down here, but obviously they're using this bright pink color, which really contrasts this sort of cream background and the sort of navy blue that they're using for the additional color on here as well. And then within the actual content of the menu itself, again, clear headers, a small graphic element that just kind of breaks up the space. Moving into the actual dishes, they're thinking about, all right, how can we apply some interest here as well? Using all capitals for the name of the dish and a bit of a bolder typeface. And then for the description, they're going back to the serif typeface that is in uppercase and lowercase and is a little bit smaller, and then using a / before the actual price there as well. So all of those decisions are going to be something that you can think about within your overall design. Do you want to use all capitals? Do you want to use lowercase? Do you want to use bold options? Do you want to use italics? Within the typefaces itself, what styles do you want to use? And how is that going to reflect the overall theme of your restaurant? Okay. So this is something that we want to really focus on within this project is this organization of the space, utilizing this hierarchy effectively and utilizing these paragraph and character styles to be able to create those and then apply them to all the different content within the menu. These are just some examples here of different variations of menus and styles that we can see, but they all kind of share that same idea. Okay. So a nice example here where you can see these graphic elements being brought into the space, you know, these clear titles for the dishes. Again, one thing you'll notice is a lot of times when you're using the titles of the dishes in a larger typeface like this, you may want to use a condensed typeface, right? Something that's going to be able to be kind of squished together a little bit more for some of those potentially longer titles. And that's something you want to take into consideration as well. Some of your titles are going to be shorter. Well, maybe that's not the best example. This one down here, for example, it's only 2 words, right? Or even here, Reuben is only 1 word. Others are going to be much longer, pepper jack, Swiss, and cheddar grilled cheese. So you're going to want to think about that within the overall design. If you are only working with Reuben, Porchetta, Darkwood, and KC Classic, and you do the whole layout and you have your titles running all the way out here, when you get down to these longer titles, that's going to affect the length of that and potentially run into 2 different lines. So make sure that you're looking at the content of the menu, pulling in not only the short titles, but the longer titles, the midway titles, looking for any of those anomalies within the space, not only the titles, but also the dish descriptions as well. Make sure you're taking that into consideration. So we're going to start with this menu project, looking at the actual sort of branding elements, looking at picking out some colors, creating a sort of logo type for this and how you potentially get that started. We're also going to work on some sketches here this week, just to get some ideas on the page, the actual formatting, whether you want to use a single page or a bifold, or whether you want it to be a portrait or landscape, vertical or horizontal. So those can kind of be worked out within the actual sketches. And then we're also going to start within InDesign, looking at applying some of these character and paragraph styles to the actual content here as well. So again, this is primarily an exercise in typesetting. So you're going to need to demonstrate the use of appropriate punctuation marks, spacing before and after paragraphs, indentions, tab and tab leaders, and whatever else is appropriate to the design. Also be sure to consider hierarchy and layout to create separate, clear separations between the different areas of the menu. And then spend time on the actual typesetting here, okay? So we want to think about, you know, within the actual typesetting here, we don't want to have any hyphens within the space. We don't want to have any typos. You know, check your spelling, especially if you're bringing in your own menu or having to recreate your own menu. Work with the grid or guidelines, and again, work with these character and paragraph styles to create a strong hierarchy and unity. Also, go back to the original fundamentals here: scale, placement, alignment, the actual type style, and other cues that can bring the visual order to the body of content provided. Keep your design clean and simple. That is the most effective way to finalize your work.